Hello, my friends. Laurie Ashcraft here. I'm your host for Viva La Evolution, produced by Recovery and Resilience Solutions, which is a training and consulting branch of Crestwood Behavioral Health. Evolution. That's what we're trying to do, right? Not what we did yesterday or last year or 10 years ago. Trying to find new ways to do the important work to help people recover and heal. So today, a very interesting guest by the name of Rob Wipond. And I first came across Rob when I read an article that he wrote. I think it was in the PRA newsletter. And he was talking about some of the responses to the 988 program. And he really woke me up. I hadn't been paying much attention to that. And gosh, the stories he told that were just happening now with 988 were stories I've heard for the last 20 and 30 years about people thinking they could trust you with your story, and then the next thing they know, they're being held against their will or treated against their will because you said something that triggered a response that made people think you were dangerous to yourself or others. So I immediately connected with him when he's talking about this. And then I found that he's written this book. This is Your Consent is Not Required. That really got my attention. So I bought the book, read the book. And he really exposes a lot of things that we're doing, often well-meaningly, that are doing harm. And we don't like to look at this stuff. We don't like to agree with him. But he's definitely got a point. And from my experience, I can say that he's right about a lot of things. So I asked him to come and talk with us and share his perspective. And I've learned a lot from him in the process. So let's take a listen to Rob and hear what he has to say about your consent is not required and a few other things. Okay, here we go. Here's Rob. Rob, I'm so grateful that you had time to talk with us this morning. After reading some of your articles and then your book, I've just been really hoping I could share you with our viewers because your perspective is so important and it's a perspective that isn't talked about very much. So thank you so much for being willing to join us this morning. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for inviting me and for your interest in these topics. I agree with you. Like you say, I think it's even though oddly involuntary commitment is in the news more and more, there's many ways in which it's not really being talked about, not really explored. So yeah, I look forward to doing that with you.
Well, I first heard about you because I was reading, I think it was the PRA newsletter, and there was a long article in there about 988 and how that's being rolled out. And I hadn't paid any attention to the rollout of 988. But boy, you really got my attention in that article. I'd like to talk a little bit about that today, a little bit about your own personal story of what interested you in this in the first place. And then definitely we'll talk about your book, which has been a real wonderful eye-opener for me. And you just touch on so many things in this book that hurt my heart before I read your book. I mean, I'm out there watching this happen, and then I see it in writing. I had to stop reading your book now and then because I had to recover from the pain I felt from myself.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I had to stop at times writing it, and there's things I don't include in the book because I even found them too hard. And I thought readers are going to have a limit to how much they can take. And really, one of the rules I worked with was, if this is a really common occurrence and I can show that, then I'm going to include it. If it's really, really unusual, I didn't include it because it could just be so inflammatory, and maybe in an unnecessary way, because I'm trying to look at the systemic issues in the whole broader system. So yeah, but I know what you mean, and I've heard this before, that some people gobble the book up because they find it like, yes, finally someone said what I've seen, what I've
Yes,
experienced.
yes.
And then for others, it's just too much. They're just like, I've seen this too often. I know it's like, nobody has said to me, gosh, this isn't true. No one who knows anything about this. Just people tend to be seeming to avoid reading it altogether. Or if they read it, they're like, this is just too true, and I can't handle it.
And I had both. I felt validated by it, and I had to like chunk it down a little bit. So, because it was like, yeah, I don't want to remember all this. I don't want to look at all this. Yeah, but thank you
Yeah.
for bringing it all to light.
No, thank you. Yeah, and this is one of the things I heard, a psychiatrist said to me a while ago. You just make the psychiatric system look, as the worst you possibly could. And I had to say to them, I'm sorry, actually, no, I didn't even get close to that. Like, this is just how bad it looks when you're
Yeah,
just being neutral about I just find that's generally true. Like, too much of what the public hears about the mental health system is coming from mental health professionals. Almost any third party that starts to wade in, like myself, it starts to become so obvious, the problems, and it becomes really disturbing that they're not being talked about and revealed more
yes.
publicly.
Yeah, and I think that's how we change things, is we get the truth out to enough people till we get a tipping point, and then change can start to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important. Many people say, it'd be great to have like a novel like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest again that really galvanizes the public awareness and could precipitate change. But I often then remind people, like, aside from it being like a brilliant novel, and it's not even easy to write those kind of novels, but still it was part of a movement at the time, right? There were many
Yeah,
people criticizing asylums. There was a big patients' rights movement in that era. There were many intellectuals and researchers speaking out. There was, mainstream media coverage of how abusive the asylums were. And then that novel appeared in the midst
yeah,
of that,
yeah,
and so that's what we need. I agree. We need
yeah.
just more and more people talking about it, looking at it from different angles, and being concerned about what's happening.
And also, I think, not just noticing what's wrong, but coming up with some new ways to do things. I've put a lot of effort into that in my work, and I find that peer support has been the thing that I've found that I can work with and support that does make a huge difference. Just having people who have been there go right into those institutions, work right alongside those professionals, and bring a whole different perspective to it.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and I believe it. I would agree. And also lawyers, like, people
Oh,
often have the
right.
same experience with that. Just having anyone who's just on your side in that
Yeah.
situation, and able to be your touchstone to the external world, the world outside the institution, and reminding you that you're still connected, and validating your experiences and saying, yeah, I'm seeing that too. This is huge for people. Just that little bit alone, you kind of think, you take it for granted in a way. People would assume that it's common, but we know from, and I know from my research that it's actually not that common. Like, people are often totally isolated in these situations,
Oh,
and you're
yeah.
suddenly subjected to this very oppressive environment in a psychiatric hospital, and have no idea often that the things that are happening could even happen in America today. You know, people say that to me all the time. I couldn't believe this is happening in America today. And in that context, they desperately need other people who know and have been through the experience, like peers or lawyers who are experienced and so on.
Well, and let's not forget journalists. You know,
Yeah,
I was
they don't
talking
they
to
don't let us into institutions very much, though.
well, I've come across some, you know, I was talking to Bob Whitaker the other day, and I said, you know, Bob, I just found this guy who's written this amazing book. And I tell him, I said, oh, I know Rob, of course. We work together on stuff. So you two are out there. And then Alex Bernard wrote an amazing book on conservatorship. I don't know if you've seen that. But
Yeah.
so I'm thinking, yes, we're writing about this stuff. We're getting some new light on the things we're doing that aren't working, that just aren't working.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Bob Whitaker at Mad in America has been really supportive of my work for many years. I really appreciate it. And yeah, you know, speaking of the 988 issue, it's been Mad in America that's been publishing most of my writing on 988.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't put that together. Well, let's talk about 988, but before we do that, let's back up a little bit and talk about your own personal experience. In your book, you share a story about your dad that was very moved my heart a lot.
Yeah, yeah, it was powerful for my whole family, really. And it was my first real encounter with the modern mental health system. This was around 1997 or so. And my dad was going through a difficult time. He was a career college professor, computer engineering, no history of mental illness,
Mhm.
quote unquote. Um, but he was going through definitely some unusual experience, difficult time after a prostate cancer diagnosis. And then the surgery was quite catastrophic, which I've learned is actually fairly common in prostate cancer surgery, that he was rendered impotent and incontinent. So just on the cusp of his retirement, to suddenly be going through this devastating sense of mortality and fragility, and then also loss of, you know, sexual function and control of his, you know, urine. Like it was a lot for him to be dealing with emotionally, you know. And he was a classic guy from the, you know, dad of the 1950s, right? One of the stern, distant, private, you know, people. And yeah, you know, I was happened to be around at the time. I'd just come to back from overseas, and so, you know, I tried to talk with him a lot through that time, but it was difficult. You know, and he's my dad too, so we had that history. Anyway, so at one point my brother and mother and he decided that he would go to the local psychiatric hospital for help. So he went voluntarily, and basically instantly he was converted from a voluntary patient into an involuntary patient, and he was
Mm.
certified and detained. And we were immediately aghast. What? You know, they can do this, and how easily, and, you know, all of that. And then they started to give him all sorts of drugs, and just got worse. He could barely stand this chemical overload. We were researching as this happened, like, what the heck are these drugs and what are they doing? And then that would just leave us aghast at how dangerous these drugs were and how ineffective the science shows they tend to be, not very helpful. And yeah, and then they start proposing electroconvulsive therapy, and we're like, what? You still do that? You know, like, well, like a lot of people just learning on the fly here. And they ultimately did against his will. He was kind of going along with the drugs a bit, but by the point they got to that, he was like, no, I don't want this. And they were like, too bad, you know, and they forced him, and he suffered really intense memory loss. Over the years, he did gain a lot of it back, but a lot of it was permanent. And so this whole experience was devastating for him, for our whole family. You know, tore us apart in a lot of ways, and it was a real eye opener for me. And so by the end of this sort of 9 months where he's bouncing in and out of the hospital, I started to think, wow, you know, who else is this happening to? And I started working in journalism at that time. So I yeah, I immediately kind of started phoning around, looking for people, and said, who else has experienced what it's like to be involuntarily committed? I want to hear your story, and I want to write about it and look at the science of it and look at the history of it and so on.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I don't think your experience was that unusual. And what I've come to see is it becomes a matter of convenience, because it's it takes more effort to sit down and be with someone and connect with them in a real presence and talk with them about what's happening and present their options and let them choose what would work for them. Uh,
Mhm.
to me, that's easy, so easy. But for some reason, when people get into the system, working in it for a while, they go for convenience, and it's more convenient to just make someone do something. So, okay, we're going to make you do this then. So things start getting slapped on. And then I've been in the position of a person who has been, I'm just going to say, mentally vulnerable. Um, and so from my experience and then seeing it happen to other people too, it's like you're already vulnerable because you've been wounded some way, whether it's a family death or some kind of a breakup or a job situation or or an illness. So you're already vulnerable. And these people come to you that you think know what they're doing. I mean, you're told these are doctors, these are nurses, these are professionals. They know how to help you. So they focus on what's wrong with you instead of what's right with you. You know, in your dad's case, someone could have said, you know, you've had a brilliant career. And yes, you've had this really devastating uh, physical illness, but you still have quite a bit of your journey ahead of you and a lot of brilliance to contribute. Let's focus on how you can. So if someone would have said to me, you know, pointed out my strengths, then that would have started to pull me back together a little bit, or just reframed it for me some way. But you're already, and so you're vulnerable. You're told there are things wrong with you, and then you're given medication, which can take your brain away. You know, now you're, at least during the initial phases of it, you're stumbling around, you're knocked out, you're now your brain is acting a whole different way than it ever has. So now you're very vulnerable. And thank goodness in my case, uh, I knew enough about the system already that I could hold on to myself enough to to keep some perspective on the whole thing. I did finally get on a medication that did really help me for quite a while. Um, but my ability to pull myself out was unusual. And I think I had that ability because I had a job, I had a family, I had money. You know, I had the things that a lot of people don't have when they get launched into this process of coming into the system.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank
Thank you
God your
for
dad had you guys.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that story. And I think it's so important for people to hear those kind of stories because I think there's this sort of cliched image out there in the general population that, oh, we only forcibly treat people, we only coerce people who are, severely psychotic and, have no understanding of reality, blah, 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 blah. And it's occasional that there are people who might sort of get close to meeting that cliched image, but it's rare. And I found that cases like yours and my father's are actually more the norm than not in most cities. Like, as you get into intense inner city, hospital or something where there's just a ton of people living on the street or at the extremes of, their lives in some ways, then yeah, maybe you'll see a slightly higher percentage of people who are really in very, very difficult states. But often it's more commonly, yeah, in lots of parts of the country in North America, uh, far more ordinary people than I think
Yeah.
people typically imagine. Yeah, who are just, as we all do, going through difficult times in their lives often. It's like I wouldn't want to give the impression that, oh, they're just, raking in anyone, although I have some chapters in my book where I do show that that is what some institutions do. It's fraud, they're
Yes.
committing fraud. But,
Yeah. Yeah.
generally I think there is a well-intentioned attitude, but it's just become very aggressive and very all encompassing with the when people start having what are actually fairly common types of distress. It's serious distress, but it's still fairly common. Those people are often now getting heavily pressured, coerced, and if they don't comply, they can be forced.
That brings us to what you talk about with 988. Would you mind uh, reviewing some of that with us?
Yeah, the history of that too is quite interesting because 25 years ago, what I'm about to talk about was really not widely known at all. In fact, I understand that news media had basically agreed not to report on it because it was like exposing the location of a safe home for abuse survivors or something. You just wouldn't do it, right? You have an ethical obligation not to do it, and that they had they considered it their obligation not to report on the fact that crisis lines routinely, covertly got calls traced, and they sent the police around to take people to psychiatric hospitals. So I first learned about this 25 years ago, and somebody said, yeah, I just called this local crisis line to get some help. I wanted to talk. And I said something like, yeah, in the millennium, I'm going to take my life. It was like years from now, I might take my life. But that was the trigger, and so the person was still on the phone, and the police showed up at her door, and she was like aghast, what's happening here? And then I asked the local crisis line, and they sort of confessed up. Flash forward 20 some years, and I started to research it, and I discovered that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in the United States, which is now the 988, they've taken over 988, routinely do this. So they say the number's about 2%, and they kind of base it on what they call an imminent risk assessment. So it's most often done with people they consider at risk of taking their own lives or potentially of harming themselves or harming someone else.
Well,
Most,
let
most,
me back up just
yeah.
a minute. So I've seen this happen with the police on people who are on some kind of an outpatient commitment. But when I read your book, it sounded like these people weren't on any kind of a,
Oh, no, no, these are
these are just
ordinary
ordinary
people.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this could be you or I instantly right now, right? Like we could do this live and you can watch if I know exactly what to say and we'll get the police to show up at your door or my door. Like
Yeah.
the worst thing about this is I can do it to you and you can do it to me. It
Yeah.
doesn't even have to like third parties. This is in the statistics we can find. You can identify the percent where a third party calls. So what happens is, yeah, somebody just, we're told to do this all the time, right? The ads say, oh, if you're feeling down, reach out, there's help out there, free, confidential, anonymous, right? That's how it's all advertised. Well, this is very misleading because it's neither confidential nor anonymous, truly. So it is to a point, but then if you say certain things, and depending on who's staffing the call, and they may have any kind of training, they could be highly trained or not trained at all, and it's kind of subjective anyway, whether they have the training or not, where they make this imminent risk assessment, which is that you might be at risk of harming yourself and really soon. You're already doing it, or it could be soon, or it could be in a few hours, or it could be in a few days. It's all very vague in the policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they just kind of make a judgment call. Like, I'm worried about you. I care for you. I'm gonna contact 911. They don't have direct call tracing powers. So what 988 does is they contact 911 and they give the details of the call, or they can directly connect the call. There's various sort of technical ways they can and do it. But essentially, the upshot is that 911 has built into it lots of technological capacity to ping mobile devices and to get the locations of phones one way or another, and sometimes increasingly accurately. Now, it's not consistent all the time, right? Just like a cell phone can be out of a coverage area, there can be technical hurdles that they have to get over. But by and large, it works. I think the number's around 80% of the time that they can track who it is, exactly where they are. They send the police out, and the police then will take the person to a psychiatric hospital. So it's important to emphasize that a psychiatric hospital. What we're not talking about here is people who are in the act of killing themselves. If they literally call, say, I just swallowed some pills, I'm calling to say goodbye, that does happen. They're usually calling 911 to do that, and so it's direct. But if they call 988 and do that, yes, then you would kind of think that's like a call for help. Maybe it's justified to send the police around, right? This is a very rare occurrence on 988, to the best of our knowledge, the best data that we have on this. That's rare. More common is just it's an imminent risk assessment. So where they're just thinking you might be at risk of future. So people are not taken to a normal hospital to pump their stomachs. They're taken to a psychiatric hospital to be assessed, to be detained, to potentially be forcibly drugged, because they're treating suicidal feelings as if they're like a mental illness these days. Yeah, and that's been a trend throughout the mental health system. So yeah, so this is anyone who calls the line is at that kind of risk. They often don't even know, unless you share that information with them, if you're, if you're already taking psychiatric medications or not, or anything like that. It's nothing to do with that. It's just
Yeah,
entirely based on the sort of subjective assessment of what you're saying about your feelings.
yeah, yeah. And you have several stories in your articles and in your book about uh, people who um, were just kind of sucked in to the whole process um, without unwittingly, and then reporting terrible stories of being drug off by the police. I can't remember any specifics, but um,
Yeah.
I've had friends that have had this happen where they've just talked to someone before 988, and of course, therapists are always trained to ask if you're suicidal, um, and then they go down this long list of things. Do you have a weapon? Do you blah blah? Has anyone in your family? And so they're completely taken off the track of being present with the person. The person who just wanted someone to talk to is now like, well, no, well, I don't know. I mean, we've got knives in the kitchen. They're trying to be answer, um, and it just digs a deeper hole. No one would say. I mean, I am so committed to. I don't want to just Pollyannize everything and not talk about what's wrong, but I really believe that if we could keep reminding people of their strengths, they'd be so much better off than if we kept reminding them of what could be wrong with them. So I think by the time, you hang up from that, then someone shows up at your door, you're starting to lose self-efficacy right there. Unless you fight back, and then that fighting gets diagnosed. There is something wrong with this person. They're being obstructive. They're being resistant. Um, I don't know. It's just
Yeah.
so distressing.
Yeah, no, all that's correct. And of course, on a average 10 to 15-minute call to the 988 line, all of that happens a lot more quickly and more automated. Like the call attendants are required within 5 minutes to get into the suicide assessment questions, and they can't go through a long list because they don't have that much time. So there's really 3 or 4 main questions that they focus on. Like, yeah, do you have a plan? Have you ever thought about this before? Are you alone? These
Yeah.
are some of the common questions I'll ask. And then your risk score is going up and up and up, even though you don't even know this is happening, because you're just noticing that, as you said, the therapist, the counselor, the volunteer on the phone is not present. Basically, they're
Yeah.
like seemingly asking these rote questions, and you're wondering what's going on, and you answer innocently, not realizing that your score might be going up and you might be becoming subjected to a police a visitation. Yeah, and then it can be quite brutal for people, and
Mhm.
I hear lots of stories of this. And it's important to emphasize, lots of people get great things from the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or from 988, right? They do find a 10-minute call just fine, and it alleviates a little stress in their day and they feel a little better, and that's great. Right? But the numbers of people this is happening to are huge. Yes, they're a relatively small percentage of the overall numbers, but it's still huge. So in the first year of 988, it was 100,000 people in America that got subjected to these kinds of emergency interventions. Most of them, a lot of them against their will, and other ones they can be voluntary, but it's essentially they're pressured. They can be coerced, like, well, we're going to send the police unless you agree to do X or Y.
Yeah.
So this is going on to a lot of people. And what I show in the data that we have is that, in fact, they say routinely it's 2% of all calls, which to me is not a small number. That's still a
No,
very
that's
large number.
yeah,
And, but it's a much higher percentage of people who are calling with suicidal feelings. So I'd say anyone who's going to call 988 who wants to talk about suicidal feelings, you need to be aware that your odds are about, anywhere from 6% to 20% of those people are getting an emergency intervention of some
mm,
kind, whether they want
mm,
it or not.
mm,
And so you need to be mindful of that. Those are pretty high odds at that point, no question.
yeah, yeah. Well, and what I'm remembering from your article is that a huge number of people said, I will never call there again. So,
Yeah, it's devastating for people. I mean, I talked to a child not so long ago who went, was called 98 just to talk about their feelings. And yeah, the child was feeling suicidal, but, you know, had no idea this could happen. And then police came, it was exposed, all this, police and ambulance outside their home,
yeah,
now exposed to the parents, exposed to the neighborhood, schoolmates know.
yeah,
By the
yeah,
time the kid's at the hospital, kid's sobbing his eyes out from the experience being so
yeah,
frightening and shocking, and the sense of betrayal. And then, so now that he's sobbing, oh, that's a psychiatric emergency, so they forcibly drug him now, right? That's even more traumatizing for him. And that's what he's saying. It's like, I will never trust. It's not just mental health professionals, or just like, I'll never trust anyone again, right?
yeah,
So this is what we've put a child in this position. And I know when I say this to people that staff these lines, are often like, well, we help more people than we harm. But I'm like, how can you possibly justify this? I mean, even if you only do that to one person a year, this is a tragedy of staggering proportions, right? That child may never be the same for the rest of their lives. It was the most traumatizing experience of that child's life. And even people who've experienced really severe trauma in their lives have told me that kind of forced treatment in the mental health system, because you're expecting to get cared for, that kind of forced treatment can be
yes,
just devastating
yes.
and frightening, terrifying, and really re-traumatizing at a very
Mhm.
deep level. So I just think, as we have to be far, far more careful than we're being as a society right now about the use of this extraordinary power that exists under mental health laws.
I know, I know. I was telling you this earlier, but I was reading something not long ago where it was a published article. Um, the group was saying we need to get rid of the mental health system as it is and replace it with love. And I thought, I kind of like that. It's inconvenient because, that means we have to love. We have to put that part of ourself out there, which I think is what really heals anyway, is getting some respect and some love from other people, not just being told there's a whole bunch of things wrong with you. I don't know how you'd put that into policy. And I know there are very few people, very, very few, who really need help. And try as you might, you can't convince them that they'd be better off if they lived somewhere different, or if they took a little medication, or whatever. So those folks, just to save their life, need someone else to make decisions for them for a while.
Well, what does that really even mean, though? I mean, people say this all the time. They try to, they point to a really extreme case that they know this guy obviously needs help. And I'll be like, well, help, yeah, help is different than force. Right. And what
Yes,
does it really
yes.
mean, right? Like to build, because there's so many ways to build connection and there's so many ways to offer help. Because what's happened now is, unfortunately, help has become synonymous with the mental health system. And actually, the evidence we have is that it's not actually particularly good at truly helping people very much. Certainly not people who are in serious distress. They actually do a little better with people who are in mild distress. And so that's why we unfortunately have, and I say unfortunately because it's sort of bad for grappling with this issue, but unfortunately we have a lot of people who have maybe gotten a little mental health help, who didn't really have very serious problems and found it helpful and went, oh great, mental health is wonderful, and aren't realizing that there's this huge arm, like 50% of people in institutions at any given time across America are there against their will and are being treated having a very different kind of experience. And it's that I talk about in the book. And I think that is important to talk about. And what does it mean to help those people truly? And I'd say the mental health system is not very good. We have no evidence. I looked at the science extensively in this area. There's nothing to support involuntary treatment. Voluntary treatment, a little bit, but most of it ends up being far more effective if it's simply free housing,
Mhm.
supports with practical daily living.
Mhm.
So like one of the things people often say to me is, oh well, this guy's living on the street and he had some serious physical illness at the same time. But Sam Timberis, one of the founders of Founding First, said to me, yeah, that was why we incarcerated a lot of people, was not because they were that mentally ill, but because of their distress and living homeless, they were suffering a physical illness. He said, but you know what, even when we cured their physical illness, they usually ended up hating us. And it was
Yeah.
because they'd get forcibly treated psychiatrically while they were there. And so then they didn't want to come to the hospital even when they were super sick. So we've created this phenomena as a society. Lots of people are living on the street with severe physical problems, and they're scared to go to the hospital because they know that they're going to get psychiatrically labeled and forcibly treated with psych meds on top of whatever physical treatment they get. So yeah, so I just go back to what's the evidence for these other things, and turns out the evidence is very robust to support that you can stabilize even the most severe people, often severely troubled people, with housing, with just practical daily supports, with people in their lives who care about them, and all that. And you've been talking a lot about sort of the strengths-based approach, and
Mhm.
yeah, and I highlight that in my book as well. And there's a lot of research to support that this is a problem throughout our society right now. We become far too reliant on diagnosing and labeling people as ill and something's wrong with them, and then sending in professionals to help. And that just sort of cuts them off from their community, and makes them feel bad about themselves and starts them often down a really negative spiral. And far better if we develop systems where there's a community around that person that is supporting them and is looking to what are their strengths and assets. How can you become a contributor again to our community, to your community, and
Yes.
what can this community offer you? And we really need to rebuild that much more robust
Absolutely.
sort of
We
sense of
do.
community, I think.
Um, there are people who um, are completely dysfunctional without medication. I'm not talking about those of us who got put on antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds for 30, 40 years, but um, there are some folks that I'm going to say with schizophrenia and bipolar, the medication really helps get them back on track. I think the problem is that it becomes a lifelong thing. But then when they try to get off of it, they get very ill again. So there's something we're not doing. I want to say that I don't want to just lump all the medications together and say they're all bad for everybody. I'm tempted to do that. I'm tempted to go down that road with you. But I've just seen too many folks who without them can't function. I think the problem is they get on the wrong dose or maybe the wrong medication. Takes a while to find the right one. And then it's seen as a lifelong kind of thing. Instead of looking at how do we titrate this? Like if you're going to get a job and go to work, you can't be falling asleep. So how can we adjust your medication so you're still functioning well, but you don't have so many side effects?
Well,
This
yeah,
is
and I just want to say, like, hey, if somebody says to me, yeah, I've researched this drug, I've tried things, I've tried this drug, I find it helps me. I don't have a problem with that, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's not my issue. My issue is people are saying this drug is not helping me. I hate these
Oh
adverse
yes,
effects and I want to get off it and they're being forced, right? That's what my book is about and that's my problem. And of course we know there is another subset of that population that are people who are lied to and coerced and I'm concerned about them, but that gets into really complex discussions around this, right? Where I just think, yeah, we have to open up that dialogue as what evidence do we really have? And the reality is this is very little studied, right? That we're both up against that. So unfortunately, our discussion, news media discussions, legislative discussions, they're dominated by anecdotes. Right?
yes,
Whoever's got the
yes.
most compelling sort of story of
Totally.
the
Yeah,
person who was helped or harmed or whatever, right? And
yeah,
and yeah, and that's really unfortunate because I really hold the system to account here. I go, look, there's a major problem here, and that is we don't have good data. It's a
yeah,
struggle even to find out how many people are being involuntarily treated, let alone what's happening to them. Nobody's even tracking what are the outcomes of forcibly treating people. And in fact, if we do go more broadly, nobody's even tracking what happens at a mass scale to people who've been in psychiatric hospitals voluntarily or involuntarily and coming out from them. Is that helping or harming them? And then the drugs themselves, there's a handful of studies, as Bob covers in his book, right? We hardly have any long-term studies of what are the effects of these drugs for most people most of the time. And the studies we do have suggest it's not looking good, which would suggest we need way more studies like that. We need to look at this more closely, but the system isn't doing it. As
yeah,
we know, like nationally, for example, it was only 2013 or 14 or so that suddenly the Center for Medicare and Medicaid decided that they were going to start tracking quality of care issues in psychiatric hospitals. They tracked quality of care in every other kind of hospital for decades.
huh,
And it was only then, under a constant sort of pressure and requesting that they finally decided, okay, we're going to track some things like how often are restraints being used,
yeah,
and
yeah.
how often are people being chemically restrained with
Mhm.
drugs and so on. So they started tracking that data and it's quite chaotic right now. Like
Yeah,
the reporting and and
yeah,
and we found this that yeah in some institutions actually like when independent auditors come in as well they end up getting three different numbers. Like there was one in New York at Bellevue Hospital as I recall, like the range was somewhere from about 1200 every week to zero
oh,
to 300. It was crazy. I don't
yeah,
really remember. I just remember the possibilities. The range was gigantic, right? It was
yeah,
absolutely astronomical, and they really didn't know what were the true numbers within
yeah,
that. And they
yeah.
essentially accused the institution of being deliberately misleading. This was a disability rights audit
Oh,
that was done, right? And they did
yeah,
because they did freedom of information requests. They looked at the official reports. They did all these different approaches and came up
yeah,
with all these different numbers. So that's the problem we're up against. And I just want to highlight what we're talking about for people who don't
yeah,
know, right? Because
yeah,
this is very common in these institutions of all kinds, right? Use of physical restraints, chemically restraining people, like deliberately just tranquilizing people so that they can't really function, right? And whether you do that in emergency and then sometimes it's prolonged, like we like you that way, we're going to keep you that way. Nursing homes do
yes.
that a lot,
Oh,
right? With
nursing homes.
elderly people, we're just going to keep you in bed all day and we're going to hit you at this dosage level that just makes
Mhm.
it so that you can't really get up.
It
And
gets back
and
to
and
convenience.
Yeah, and this is really becoming increasingly widespread, not less so. It's becoming more common
I'm sure.
across institutions
Yeah.
right now. And that's one thing I explore throughout the book is like all these different institutions are using these powerful mental health laws as forms of control. So schools being a dominant one. So elementary public schools, routinely now teachers with using it for disciplinary purposes with children. They will call 911 and get the child taken up to a psychiatric hospital. If the child's in distress, if the child's being disruptive, we know class sizes are getting out of control. And, the teachers have lots of discipline problems in schools today. And this is becoming one of the dominant ways of approaching it is to get the kids psychiatrized, get them labeled, get them thrown on a drug that essentially diminishes their energy and their creative capacity and all that, but makes them more easily to control. It's a really dangerous trend.
But, I want to use the word weaponizing. And in cases like what you're describing, it's like weaponizing mental health.
I
And
think it's like that, and I appreciate using that word, but it's important to know that the broader public sees that as inflammatory or whatever, like because it's still pitched as, oh, we're helping all these people. They lack insight, they don't realize it. We're going to give them a drug, they're going to be happy, they're going to be cured. Well, none of that is true, right? What's really happening is this is an act of control. I mean, it's not that people don't have the good intention. I think a lot of people
yeah,
do. They have this belief and out there, but often what plays out, especially if the patient is putting up resistance, then often what plays out is very negative. Like if the patient does find it helpful, as I've said, that's a whole different track
yeah,
they get on,
yeah.
right? But if they don't and they start and they say that, then we're putting that child on a different track altogether. That where is that leading? Where we're basically fighting them into submission and trying to convince them they have a disease that they don't believe they have and that we can't actually even prove they have because there are no, biological evidence for a lot of these mental disorders. So we're just kind of trying to convince this kid of something, and we're giving them a drug that they don't find helpful. It becomes just a brutal experience for this child, and over
Yeah.
time, where can that really lead?
I'm not familiar with what's going on with children, so but you're not surprising me. Um, and I keep coming back to, I guess what I keep coming back to is I think what works is relationship and presence. And the times when behavioral health professionals are willing to put their heart on the line with people, that's when the healing happens. That's when the conversation takes place. That's when the options get presented. That's when the person stays in control of their treatment with the good consultation and support from a professional. That, in my mind, that's how it should happen. But in so many cases, it's just boiled down to what's convenient, what's quick, what's easy. When you told me that, I think you just said that within 5 minutes of a crisis call, I, as a counselor, would need to bring up suicide. Did you say that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the policy.
Yeah. So, no wonder it doesn't work. The
Yeah,
main thing that works, which is a human being caring and respecting you and helping
yeah.
you sort things out,
Oh,
there's
it's
no room
huge.
for that.
Yeah, no, it's huge. Just being listened to for a lot of people. People have said to me when I've interviewed them, like,
Yeah.
"Oh, wow, like this was, I've been in the mental health system for, a decade, and you're the first person who's actually listened to my story from start to finish." And I'm feeling so much better. Like people say that to me, and it's nice in a way, but it's also really tragic, right? That they
Tragic.
felt that they were never listened to.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I agree. Like, and there's even a term for that in the literature, therapeutic alliance, right? Where they found that, oh, it almost doesn't matter what mental health approach you take. If the client and the counselor get along, have mutual respect, treat each other well, almost any treatment can work. And they'll both report it working, both
I
sides will
think,
say, yeah, I think we are getting better. But so much of it is just about the relationship, right? And so, yeah, anywhere we can build those relationships where they seem friendly and supportive in some way and understanding. And, I think friendship's a great model because you also don't just lie to your friend. I don't tell you, I think what you're doing's perfect, right, and great when I don't think that. I'm not paid to lie to you in a way a therapist sometimes is, right? Or paid to manipulate or whatever, right?
yeah,
I'm just me, right? And so we learn from those kinds of relationships where, yeah, the honesty and I might just say, like, you're driving me crazy with your this, that, or the other, right? And that sometimes people need to hear that to kind of,
yeah,
oh,
yeah,
right, like relationships are mutual. And that's
right.
something, again, that if I'm paying you $200 an hour to listen to me, you're probably not going to tell me. And if you did tell me, if you did say, Rob, I think you're an idiot, you'd probably lose your license. So you're not allowed to behave that way. Only friends can do that to each other. They go, Rob, you're being an idiot right now. There's sometimes I've really appreciated oh yeah, I guess I am. Right? It's like, there's a love there, right? There's a love there that makes that work. And so yeah, I think you're right. And I think why I'm elaborating on it's like I think it's also just a metaphor that we can apply to all these other situations in life, right? So it's not just, well, if you have one person who listens to you, that's going to solve everybody's problems, right? We're not saying that. We're just saying this is a key element and it should definitely be the crucial part of the mental health system. And it's
Yes,
shocking that it's not,
yes,
right? And
yes,
then also it needs to be more robustly present, rebuilt in many ways in our very fragmented society that's actually becoming increasingly polarized and hostile. And
yes,
I'm aghast at times at the attitudes towards homeless populations that I'm confronting, the things people are willing to say about how they actually want to kill them. And I think in some cases they're
yeah,
serious, right? They're not,
yes,
yeah, like I think we should, blah, 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 blah. And it's shocking that level of hostility, and where's that really coming from? And that's going in the opposite direction what we're
yeah.
talking about.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up here, but it's just been a delight talking to you. I've been looking forward to it for ever since we agreed. So thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for bringing to light things we don't think about or put effort into very often. It's
All
wonderful,
right,
wonderful.
thank you.
Well, that was a pretty exciting ride with Rob. Um, Gosh, I wish he was wrong about what he says, but I know he's not. Um, we've got to fix ourselves, folks. We've got so many things that are broken, and we just keep doing them, even when we know they don't work. We've got to find a better way. We just have to. Um, yeah. So let's keep thinking about that. Let's keep trying some new things. Let's just stop falling back on what we got trained in or what we've always done. Let's look for new ways to do things. It's sometimes easy to point out everything that we're not doing well. But then when it comes to trying to find a better way to do it, then it gets harder. Then that's when the challenging part comes in. But we can do this. We can come up with new and better ways to do this work. So let's not give up. Let's work harder to do things better. Okay. Thanks a lot for joining us. Good to see you again, and see you next time.